Begin by asking you kind of a personal, perhaps even somewhat uncomfortable question. What is the worst decision or the biggest mistake you've ever made in your life? Think about that for a moment. What's the worst decision, the biggest mistake you've ever made? Some of you might say, I made a huge mistake in my first marriage. I married the wrong person. I married too young. Or I didn't work on it hard enough. I gave up too early. Others of you might say, my biggest mistake was not finishing high school or not finishing college. For others of you, it might have been a financial decision. Just in retrospect, it was just terrible. Others of you might say that it was an affair that you had or an abortion that you had. But none of us likes to be reminded of these painful memories, do we? But I bring it up because today we're going to talk about maybe why we make big mistakes and how we can avoid them in the future. Well, this is the second of a 4-part series we're calling Lessons from the Life of Moses. And my hope would be that we would learn some very valuable life lessons from a man who himself seemed to have to learn every lesson the hardest way. My hope is that we would learn from his failures. And so hopefully avoid some of those heartbreaks ourselves, and that we would learn from some of his successes, and so we would experience some of the same, positive things in our own lives. Last week we looked at the events surrounding Moses' childhood, and we concluded that lesson number 1 from the life of Moses was that God can take even the most difficult childhood, the most confusing and heartbreaking events and circumstances that happen in our lives at any time when we're young or older, things that just happen beyond our control, literally anything and everything. God can take those things and turn them somehow eventually for our good and his purposes. Today we come to Exodus chapter 2, where it says, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out among his own people and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that, seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Moses one day decides to get a first-hand look at the conditions that the Hebrew slaves were under. And as he does, he witnesses a terrible injustice. An Egyptian just unmercifully beating a Hebrew. Now Moses had been raised by his mother, who worked as sort of a nanny to Pharaoh's daughter in King Pharaoh's palace. You may recall from last week. So he was raised in the culture of the Egyptians, but he knows that he's really Hebrew by race, by birth. And so when Moses sees what he now understands as a fellow Hebrew being beaten like this by an Egyptian, who was probably a soldier or a work foreman of some kind, Moses was just outraged. It finally got to him. He was incensed to the point where he looks around, thinks no one is looking, and he kills the Egyptian and buries him in the sand. Now, the killing of this Egyptian was not by God's leading or by God's will. It was a result of Moses' self-will. If you look at those verses, who is conspicuous by his absence? God. There's not one mention of God's involvement in any way. Verse 12 says that Moses looked this way, he looked that way. Which way didn't he look? He didn't look up. He glanced to the right, no one was looking. Glanced to the left, the coast was clear. But he failed to look up. He failed to realize that God is always watching, even what we think is done in secret. Now Moses knew that what he had done was wrong. That's why he immediately hid the dead Egyptian in the sand. His guilt, led him to try to cover up what he had done. However, in verses 13 and 14, it says the next day he went out and he saw a couple of Hebrews and they were arguing. They were fighting. He asked one guy, hey, why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? And the man said, well, who made you ruler over us? Are you thinking about killing me as you did the Egyptian? Moses was afraid and realized that what he had done had become known. Now my guess is that the previous day Moses had walked away from burying the Egyptian thinking, nobody saw. I got away with it. But not only had God seen, someone else had seen too. And in verse 15 it says, when Pharaoh heard this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. Moses runs for his life. He makes what is much more than just a mistake. He does a terrible thing. And he thinks maybe there'll be no consequences, that no one will know. But his attempted cover-up plan is foiled, and Moses finds himself hitting rock bottom. He goes from a life of luxury and prestige to suddenly a life of fear as a fugitive. Think about it. In what appears to be less than 48 hours, Moses, who had everything in the world, power, riches, all of life's comforts, in less than 48 hours, he finds himself with absolutely nothing. You know, in our wildest imaginations, I don't know if we can begin to understand or feel what Moses must have felt as he ran off to this other country and sat down by a well. He must have thought, what have I done? What have I done? You know, not only have I offended God that I feel like I love, I've lost my family, I've lost my friends, my home, my position, my future, and I blew it all. I've lost everything. And Moses remained in hiding as a refugee and a fugitive for 40 years. That's a pretty high price to pay. Lessons from the life of Moses. What can we learn, do you think, from that experience? Well, hang on to that thought. We're going to take a short detour and then come back to Moses in a moment. But right now I want to speak to you for a second about the sovereignty of God. Now, to say that God is sovereign means that he has all authority. God's sovereignty means that he is subject to none. He is hindered by no one. He answers to no one. In this vast universe and beyond the confines of this universe, you know, through the infinite realms of eternity, God rules and reigns in total, absolute, unlimited power and authority. That is sovereignty. He is sovereign over everything. Now, some Bible scholars and theologians have carried this so far as to say that since God has absolute, total rule and control, then everything that takes place happens because God determined it to be that way. That before God even created the world, he predetermined everything that would happen in the world, and nothing or no one can question, interrupt, or alter God's plan in any way. And this kind of thinking is where a thing called Calvinism sprung up. Maybe you've heard of it. Calvinism is named after a man, John Calvin, who came up with this 5-point theology. Number one is total depravity. Man is sinful by nature, by birth. Just when we are born, we have a sinful nature. It's just who we are. And man has no ability in any way to cause himself to be right with God. The second point of Calvinism is unconditional election. It means that God chose or elected who would be saved and who would be lost, who would go to heaven, who would go to hell, and man has absolutely no say in the matter because God is sovereign. See, God can do anything. Number three is limited atonement. When Jesus died on the cross, his death was not for the whole world, but the atonement was limited to the sins of those who had been predestined by God for salvation. Point number four in Calvinism is irresistible grace, meaning that everyone who God had chosen to come to him would, because to them his grace would be irresistible. And number five is eternal security. The elect, that is those who God had chosen to be saved, cannot under any circumstances lose their salvation or even avoid their salvation. That's Calvinism in a very abbreviated form. And believe it or not, a whole lot of Christians around the world adhere to that theology. Well, then, as a reaction to John Calvin's theory or theology, a guy named Jacob Arminian came up with what we now call Arminianism. Arminianism stresses that each person has a free will and can choose or decide for themselves. Arminianism argued if man cannot exercise free will, then how can God hold us accountable for our actions? In contrast to Calvinism, which is based on that people are saved only by God's election or predestining them, Arminianism is based on the concept of free will, that God has given to each person the free will to choose whether to come to him or not. But I'd like to ask you to consider this possible way to reconcile these two extremes. And that is what I believe. God sovereignly decided to give man a free will. God sovereignly chose to allow man to have the freedom to choose him or to reject him. And in that way, the free will of man and the sovereignty of God don't contradict each other. God has sovereignly decided to give man free will. God hasn't decided which choices we would make. He has only decided that we would be free to choose them. And this not only affects us spiritually, but in other areas of life as well. I mean, Don's a big car guy, as you guys may know, and we all like to have different kinds of cars that we drive. We choose the kind of car or vehicle we like, for different reasons. And it may seem like a small liberty to choose the kind of car you want, but take it away and see what happens. Just think of our government. It issued everyone in our country a yellow Volkswagen. Within a week, people would paint it a different color. Some would add a sunroof. Some would add fog lights. Some would put a bigger engine in it, add chrome wheels. Some would even make it into a camper. Some would lower it. Some would raise it. Some would stretch it. Some would compact it. Anything so as to have our mark of individuality. We're the same about clothes. There's a real diversity of fashion even here in our church. There's the polo and Marcus Neiman crowd. That's which would be me. Neiman Marcus crowd. That'd be me. There's kind of the jeans and tennis shoes crowd. There's high fashion. There's low fashion, and there's no fashion. But again, we may not think of it often, but I would guess we all enjoy the freedom to dress like we want. Take that freedom away. Imagine having government-issued mandatory gray uniforms that everyone has to wear every day. We would have a revolution in our country the next day. You see, God has given us the privilege of choice. We can choose what career field we want to go to. We can decide where we want to live, what kind of music we listen to, how we relax, just what direction our lives take. God has given us minds and wills and a very strong sense of individual personality. He has granted us a very high level of freedom in the choices and decisions of life. He gave us the freedom to make good, wise decisions, but also the freedom to make really bad decisions, rotten decisions, evil choices, short-sighted choices, ill-advised decisions, even the freedom to reject Him and His love. As you know, when Adam and Eve faced their first big freedom test, they flunked it miserably. But God didn't revoke man's freedom of choice. He didn't turn us into puppets or robots then, where we just had to do what He said. Still today, each of us enjoys freedom of choice. Out of all of God's creation, only humankind has been given the power of choice. I mean, geese do not choose to migrate south for the winter. Bears don't choose to hibernate. Animals live and react by instinct. The sun and the moon and the stars, they didn't choose their particular places in the universe. The four seasons don't rotate annually, by their own choice. It's all by God's design. But He has given to man, each person, you and I, the power and the privilege to choose. And it's out of this freedom of choice that sinful humankind has digressed into things like hedonism and individualism, where we're ruled and driven by self-interest, where we say, I call my own shots. I'm in charge of my life. I make my own decisions. I answer to nobody. Now understand, I'm not talking about the appropriate, healthy sense of self-awareness, a self-assertion that we all ought to have. God made us all unique and different and individual, and that's great. What I'm talking about is that runaway sense of sovereignty that we have over our own life and our own future. I'm the captain of my own ship. I'm the master of my destiny. And right here in Norman, Oklahoma, and even right here in our church, there may be some who claim to be Christians even, who clearly captain their own ships, who clearly call their own shots, set their own agendas, forge their own futures. And sometimes we become like little gods, sovereignly ruling over a kingdom called self. And you know something? It's fully possible to portray a saccharine sweet exterior to everyone around you, but on the inside, have an independent, individualistic streak that influences every decision that we make. In fact, some of the most hardcore individualists come across initially as meek and mild people. But deep down there is a defiance. There is an independent spirit that nobody better challenge. Not even God. But that's a choice that we're free to make. However, there are consequences. In life, there are basically two roads you can walk down. One road is marked walking in God's ways, and the other road is marked walking in your own ways. God's will or self-will. And God has given each of us a free will to choose between the two. One choice leads to God's blessing in our life. The other choice leads to eventual failure and futility. Now back to Moses. In Exodus chapter 2, Moses makes a bad choice. He ignored God's will. He took the road marked self-will, and it led to a huge mistake. Terrible, terrible thing that he did. And it sent his life into a 40-year tailspin. You know, King David once took the road of self-will. He said, who cares what's right or wrong? I want to sleep with Bathsheba. I'm the king. That's what I'm going to do. Jonah, Samson, and many others in the Bible brought enormous suffering and pain upon themselves through similar self-willed mistakes. And if we had time, you know, and if we were willing to be totally honest, we could probably tell some stories in this place today of different ones of us at times when we acted in self-will and we made a huge mistake. And man, did we pay. It left us and maybe other people that we love in a huge pile of hurt because we did what we wanted to do and we didn't care. And in Proverbs chapter 14 it says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but down the road lies destruction. Now, self-will will not always lead to failure and heartache immediately. Sometimes in this world, self-will leads people in certain situations to success. Being self-absorbed, looking out only for number one, enables some people to achieve their self-centered goals. But if self-will doesn't immediately or soon end up in failure, it will eventually. And it will wind up in a wasted life. A wasted life in terms of eternal matters. Success may be a little bit in the here and now, but failure, total failure in God's eyes and in eternity. However, for those who choose to live by God's will, rather than self-will, that promises to lead to a life of God's blessings on your life here and an infinitely better experience in the next life. Lesson number 2 from the life of Moses, God has given us a free will. With it, we can choose self or God. One leads to failure and or a wasted life. The other leads to God's blessing. But you know, if this is the case, then why don't we more often stop to ask, what is God's will? You know, what would God want us to do? Even as believers, sometimes we don't think about it. We just do things without, even as believers, it didn't cross our minds. We become so accustomed to calling our own shots that we don't even think sometimes to stop and ask, God, what would you want me to do? What would be pleasing to you? Moses perhaps had that independent spirit in him that many of us have. In choosing self-will and failing to even really seek to find God's will. In other cases, we may have a pretty good idea of what God wants us to do, but it conflicts with what we want to do. And so sometimes we just make a choice. We do what we want to do regardless of what we know God wants us to do. Sometimes we don't ask God because we know He's going to tell us to do something that we don't want to do, or tell us to not do something that we know is wrong that we want to do. Self-will is so strong. It's so deceptive, and it's not a habit easily broken. However, acting in self-will leads eventually and inevitably to paying a heavy price. Failure, a wasted life, and an unthinkable eternity. God never honors or blesses self-will over His will. He allows it because He has given us the power of free will. He says, you know, you can ignore my loving counsel. You can insist on self-will. You know, you've got a free will to make that choice, but one day you're going to regret it. Moses learned that lesson the hard way. How about you? Who really calls the shots in your life these days? How do you make big decisions? Do you seek to do God's will? You always think, what would be the thing that would be most pleasing to God? Or do you pretty much live by self-will? Your main thought being, well, I want to do what I want to do. Well, it's usually self-will that leads to the big mistakes in life that we thought about earlier. Remember, I asked you a question, what's the worst mistake? What are the biggest, things that you've done in your life that you regret? I bet in almost every case, in retrospect, self-will, thinking only of what you wanted, I bet it played a big part in those costly decisions and mistakes that we all made. Now, the good news is that no matter how big or bad our failures, and probably no one here has committed murder. So if you've done something less than murder, which would probably be all of us, no matter how big or bad it may seem, it's never too late. It's never too late to turn things around. It's never too late because we have a forgiving God. A God who gives second chances and third chances and fourth chances and fifth chances. But we can save ourselves a lot of grief and heartbreak by choosing God's will instead of insisting on self-will and making those decisions that really backfire on us. Now, have you got any situations in your life right now where self-will is battling against God's will? Are you thinking about, are you tempted by something? Are you considering something? Are you involved in something that you know right now, boy, if I get found out, if things don't happen just right, this could destroy my family, this could destroy my marriage, this could get me fired from my job. There's a lot at stake when we choose self-will over God's will. One choice leads to failure and or a wasted life. The wise choice leads to God's blessing in your life.